a black doctor, exhausted after a grueling week of medical missions overseas, finally stepped into the airport, eager to reunite with his family. But within moments, his excitement turned to disbelief. A security officer, seemingly fixated on his presence, pulled him aside with no explanation, escalating the situation in front of stunned travelers. Humiliated but composed, the doctor endured the baseless interrogation. Yet, just 10 minutes later, a revelation turned the tables in the most unexpected way, leaving the entire terminal speechless and setting off a series of events that would change lives forever. What happened next is a story of resilience, justice, and the power of truth. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from, and if this story resonates. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that challenge perspectives and inspire action. It all began on a seemingly ordinary day. The airport was alive, a hive of activity buzzing with the stories of countless lives converging and diverging in the great American ritual of travel. Sunlight spilled through the massive glass windows, pooling onto polished floors that reflected hurried footsteps and the click of rolling suitcases. The hum of voices, English peppered with Spanish, a smattering of Mandarin, and a southern drawl or two, melded with the rhythm of announcements echoing from the loudspeakers. In this symphony of movement stood Elias Harper, a man who had seen the arc of decades bend and twist with promises both broken and fulfilled. Elias, a tall, dignified black man in his late 60s, wore a quiet confidence as weathered as the leather of his well-loved jacket. His hands, thick and calloused from a life of work, carried a suitcase that had traveled more miles than most men dared to dream. Elias wasn't a man given to unnecessary theatrics. Yet today, he had chosen deliberately to leave behind the polished trappings of his success. The tailored suits and the chauffeur waiting at his beck and call. Instead, he had stepped into the world as just another man, clothed in jeans, a sweater frayed at the cuffs, and shoes scuffed from years of faithful service. This was not a performance but an experiment, a confrontation with the unspoken. And the unspoken, well, it had already started whispering. The first glance came from the woman at the coffee stand. She looked up from her register, her smile faltering for just a second as her eyes skimmed over Elias. She recovered quickly, pouring his coffee with a polite efficiency that still carried the trace of something unsaid. Something that lingered in the corners of her carefully trained hospitality. At the security checkpoint, the whispers turned into subtle actions. The agent waved others through with a rhythm that seemed nearly mechanical. Until Elias approached, the man hesitated, his eyes flicking to Elias's worn jacket, the silver streaks in his hair. He asked a question about Elias's ticket, then another about his destination, his tone too casual to be genuine. A random selection for additional screening followed, the pats of gloved hands more thorough than they needed to be. Elias said nothing. He had learned long ago that silence could sometimes speak louder than words. The terminal itself seemed to bristle with small challenges. A seat that remained empty next to him until no others were left. A clerk at a boutique store who watched him beat too long as he examined a pair of sunglasses. None of it was new to Elias. He had felt these ripples of judgment all his life. What stung wasn't their presence but their persistence. Their unrelenting grip on the everyday. By the time Elias reached his gate, the rhythm of the day had begun to crescendo. The space hummed with a familiar tension. Business travelers clutched laptops and briefcases, exchanging knowing glances. Families corralled children as announcements of boarding groups crackled overhead. Elias, ticket in hand, stepped into the first-class boarding line, his quiet presence drawing eyes like a stone dropped into still water. "Excuse me, sir," a gate agent said, her voice crisp but edged with doubt. "Are you sure this is your boarding group?" Elias's dark eyes met hers, steady and unblinking. "Quite sure," he said, his voice low, steady, and calm, a voice that had weathered decades of questions like this one. He handed over his ticket, letting the crisp paper speak where words felt redundant. Her fingers hesitated over the scanner, her professionalism battling something deeper, something that had no place here but had somehow slipped through anyway. Behind Elias, a man chuckled. The sound was sharp, cutting, and unmistakably meant for him. Guess they're letting just about anyone up here these days, the man said, his voice loud enough for several passengers to hear. He wore the kind of suit that shouted success. His wrist adorned with a watch that gleamed like a trophy. Elias didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He'd heard this voice before. In boardrooms and back alleys. In the hushed tones of neighbors and the booming confidence of those who thought themselves untouchable. It was a voice as old as the soil beneath his feet. A voice that had been refined but never silenced. The gate agent cleared her throat, handing back the ticket. "Enjoy your flight, sir," she said, her tone clipped. Elias nodded, stepping forward with deliberate ease. His back straight, his shoulders squared, but as he walked toward the jet bridge, he felt the weight of every gaze on him. A burden he had carried for a lifetime. He had chosen this day, this experiment, to see if the world had changed. But the world, it seemed, was always quick to remind him that some things stayed stubbornly the same. And yet, Elias wasn't angry. Not yet. Anger, he knew, would come later. For now, he was simply tired. And tired, as he had learned long ago, was a dangerous place to be. This chapter sets the stage with a slow build, each encounter adding a layer to the implicit, unspoken tension of racism in daily life. The rhythm mirrors the subtle escalation of challenges, drawing readers into Elias's world with an understated but powerful momentum. Let me know if you'd like adjustments or the next chapter. The jet bridge hummed faintly beneath Elias's feet, the metal surface cold under his shoes, as if the air itself were bracing for what was to come. Ahead, the narrow passage opened to the polished entryway of the aircraft, a gateway to another world. First class, they called it, though the phrase seemed to carry a burden far heavier than its mere description of luxury. Elias stepped forward, his suitcase rolling softly behind him, the handle worn smooth by years of travel. The flight attendant standing at the door greeted him with a smile so precisely measured it could have been cut with a ruler. Her name tag read, Margaret, and her uniform was immaculate. Pressed to perfection, she glanced at his ticket, then at him, the corners of her mouth twitching ever so slightly as her eyes lingered on the scuffed leather of his jacket. "Welcome aboard," she said, her tone polite but clipped, as though the effort cost her something. Elias nodded in response, his deep baritone offering a quiet, "Thank you." He moved past her into the cabin, where the atmosphere shifted. The warm lighting and plush caramel leather seats spoke of exclusivity. Yet the air felt tighter, as if it were held together by the invisible threads of judgment. The murmurs began almost immediately, low and indistinct, but unmistakably about him. "Does he belong up here?" a woman whispered to her companion. Her voice muffled but loud enough to carry. Elias didn't look her way, though he caught her reflection in the polished surface of a nearby luggage bin. She was white, her hair swept back in a severe bun, her designer scarf draped over her shoulders like a flag of conquest. Elias walked deliberately to his seat. 1A, the prized position at the front of the cabin. The seat was wide, its armrests gleaming, its controls promising comfort at the touch of a button. He placed his suitcase in the overhead bin with care, feeling the weight of the stairs pressing against his back. "Excuse me, sir." A sharp voice pierced the air. It was Margaret, standing just a few feet away, her hands clasped neatly in front of her. Her smile was gone now, replaced by something colder. "Are you certain this is your seat?" Elias turned to face her, meeting her gaze with quiet intensity. "Quite certain," he said evenly, producing his ticket with a measured movement. He handed it to her, his eyes steady, his voice calm but unyielding. Margaret examined the ticket as though it might reveal a hidden flaw. Something to confirm the doubt written plainly on her face. Behind her, another passenger, a man in his 60s, dressed in an impeccable gray suit, folded his arms and smirked. "Must have been some kind of mix-up," the man said, his voice loud enough to cut through the cabin. "Or maybe he's a friend of the pilot?" The laughter that followed was brittle, like glass about to shatter. Margaret handed the ticket back with a tight-lipped nod, her professionalism cracking at the edges. "Very well, sir," she said, her voice clipped. "Let us know if you need anything." Elias took his seat, feeling the eyes of the cabin passengers burn into him. The businessman, still smirking, leaned over to his seatmate and muttered something inaudible, drawing a soft chuckle from the younger man beside him. Elias stared ahead, his hands resting on the armrests. The cabin around him was a symphony of subtle slights, the whispers that stopped as he turned his head. The brief, appraising glances that quickly shifted away. The way the flight attendant lingered just a little longer by his seat as she offered champagne to the passengers around him. He thought about the first time he'd flown in first class. Decades ago. He had been younger then. His heart still raw with the sting of countless rejections. His body still tense from the effort of constantly proving himself. That flight had felt like a triumph. A moment of arrival. But now? Now it felt like a test. A gauntlet he hadn't asked to run. A commotion at the back of the cabin broke his reverie. A young black man in economy had stepped forward, mistakenly entering first class in search of a restroom. A second flight attendant intercepted him. Her voice firm but polite. "Sir, the restrooms for economy passengers are at the back of the plane." The man, startled, stammered an apology and retreated. His shoulders hunched. The flight attendant turned away with a sigh, muttering something under her breath as she adjusted her uniform. Elias watched the scene unfold, a faint flicker of anger rising in his chest. It wasn't the young man's retreat that troubled him most, it was the way the rest of the cabin reacted. Or didn't. Some passengers snickered softly, others shook their heads, but most said nothing, their silence as damning as the laughter. This was how it always was. Elias thought, not with shouts, not with fists, but with the quiet erosion of dignity. The thousand little cuts that bled a man's spirit dry. He looked out the window, his reflection staring back at him. A face etched with years of resilience, of quiet battles fought and won. The cabin settled again, the hum of the engines filling the space. Elias leaned back in his seat, letting his hand rest lightly on the armrest. He had chosen this journey not because he sought to prove anything to anyone, but because he needed to remind himself of the world's contours, its harsh edges and its fleeting graces. And as the plane taxied toward the runway, he felt the weight of the unspoken settle around him once more. He closed his eyes, not to escape, but to prepare. This was only the beginning. The cabin settled into its rhythm, a quiet choreography of flight attendants moving through the aisles, passengers adjusting pillows, and the faint rustle of newspapers mingling with the low hum of the engines. Elias sat still, his hands resting lightly on his thighs, his face calm but his mind alert. He had spent decades honing this stillness, knowing that for a black man in certain spaces, stillness was survival, a way to deflect attention without disappearing altogether. A shadow fell over him, and he looked up to see Margaret standing there again, her professional mask firmly in place. In her hands was a glass of champagne on a small silver tray. "Your champagne, sir," she said, her tone overly bright, as if rehearsed. But her eyes betrayed her. They lingered too long on the worn edges of his sweater, the weathered leather of his jacket. "Thank you," Elias replied evenly, taking the glass. He held it for a moment, its cool surface grounding him in the moment. He knew this was meant to smooth things over, an offering as much for her own guilt as for his supposed comfort. It didn't matter. The unspoken words hung between them like fog, dense, opaque, and inescapable. Margaret hesitated, as if expecting him to say something more, perhaps to offer some absolution. When none came, she moved on, her heels clicking softly on the plush carpet as she disappeared down the aisle. Elias turned his gaze to the window, watching as the horizon tilted, the ground falling away beneath the plane. He let out a slow breath, willing himself to relax, but the tension in the cabin seemed to grow with each passing moment. Across the aisle, a middle-aged woman in a navy pantsuit adjusted her scarf, casting a sidelong glance at him. When their eyes met, she offered a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes, then quickly turned her attention back to her tablet. Beside her, a man in his 30s lowered his voice as he spoke on the phone. His words clipped but unmistakable. Must be some kind of affirmative action thing. What else could it be? Elias's jaw tightened, but he kept his gaze steady, staring out at the endless expanse of clouds. He'd heard it all before. The assumptions, the coded language, The sly insinuations that his presence in a place like this was always contingent. Always suspect. Success, no matter how hard-earned, was never quite enough to dispel the specter of doubt. The tension reached a new pitch when the first meal service began. A flight attendant rolled a cart down the aisle, stopping at each row to take orders. When she reached Elias, she hesitated, her hand hovering over her tablet. "And for you, sir?" she asked, her voice polite but cautious, as though she expected him to ask for something out of place. Elias glanced at the menu he'd been handed earlier. "I'll have the salmon," he said, his tone deliberately measured. The attendant hesitated, her smile faltering for the briefest moment before she scribbled something on her tablet and moved on. As she walked away, Elias caught the faintest whisper from the row behind him. "Salmon," a man muttered, his voice dripping with incredulity. Of course. It was a small thing. A tiny, insignificant barb, but it carried the weight of a lifetime. Elias felt it like a stone in his chest, pressing down on his ribs, stealing the air from his lungs. He set his jaw, his fingers gripping the armrest as he reminded himself to breathe. The meal arrived soon after. The plate carefully arranged, the silverware polished to a shine. Elias picked up his fork, ignoring the flicker of a camera flash to his right. He turned his head slightly, catching a glimpse of the man in the gray suit snapping a photo with his phone. His smirk unmistakable. Elias set down his fork, his appetite fading. He leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes against the noise. The whispers, the weight of it all. He thought about his parents. His father, who had endured humiliation after humiliation to provide for his family. And his mother, whose quiet strength had been a shield against the world's unrelenting cruelty. What would they think of this moment? Would they tell him to fight? Or to endure? His thoughts were interrupted by the voice of a flight attendant. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her tone hesitant. It was Sophia, the younger attendant who had been watching him with quiet curiosity since the flight began. She held a napkin in her hand, her expression a mix of concern and uncertainty. "I noticed. I thought you might need this." Elias looked at her, his brow furrowing. Then he saw what she held, a small note scrawled on the back of the napkin. "I see you. You belong here." For the first time since boarding, Elias felt a flicker of warmth in his chest. He took the napkin, his fingers brushing against hers briefly. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice heavy with gratitude. Sophia nodded, her cheeks flushing slightly as she stepped away. It wasn't much, Elias thought, but it was something, a small light in the darkness. As the cabin lights dimmed and the passengers settled into their routines, Elias leaned back in his seat, the napkin still clutched in his hand. The challenges weren't over, he knew that much, but in this moment, he allowed himself to feel the smallest measure of hope. The cabin was hushed now, the subdued light casting soft shadows over the rows of reclined seats. The gentle hum of the engines served as a backdrop to the quiet sounds of luxury. Glasses clinking softly, the occasional shuffle of paper, and murmured conversations. But beneath the surface, something simmered, a tension that refused to be ignored. Elias Harper sat still in his seat, his fingers brushing against the note Sophia had handed him earlier. The words, "I see you, you belong here," lingered in his mind, a quiet affirmation that felt both tender and defiant. It was a rare kindness, a flicker of humanity in a space that had thus far offered only suspicion and scrutiny. He was jolted from his thoughts by a sudden, sharp voice. "Excuse me." A woman in the row behind him leaned forward, her expression a carefully constructed mask of indignation. She was in her late 40s, her tailored blazer and pearl earrings speaking of a life built on appearances. "This gentleman just bumped into my seat and didn't even apologize." Elias turned, confused. He hadn't moved from his seat since the meal service. "Ma'am, I don't believe I..." "Oh, you did," she interrupted, her voice growing louder, inviting attention. "Some people just don't understand common courtesy." Heads turned toward the commotion, passengers craning their necks to see what was happening. The businessman in the gray suit smirked again, clearly enjoying the spectacle. Margaret appeared almost instantly, her expression sharp and ready for confrontation. What seems to be the issue here? She asked. Her voice tinged with an authority that felt misplaced. This man bumped my seat, the woman said, gesturing at Elias, her tone laced with irritation. And he didn't even have the decency to apologize. Margaret turned to Elias, her gaze steely. Sir, is this true? No, Elias replied evenly, his voice calm but firm. I haven't moved from this seat. For a moment, the air grew heavy, the tension palpable. The woman shifted uncomfortably under Elias's steady gaze but refused to back down. Margaret hesitated, her eyes darting between them, as if weighing whose version of the story to believe. Before she could speak, Sophia stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. I saw what happened, she said, her tone measured but resolute. The gentleman didn't bump her seat. She leaned back suddenly, and I think she may have misunderstood. The woman's face flushed a deep red. Well, she began. But her words faltered under the weight of Sophia's calm assertion. Is that true, ma'am? Margaret asked, her tone softening slightly as she looked at the woman. The woman waved her hand dismissively, as though brushing away an inconvenience. It's fine, forget it, she muttered, sinking back into her seat. Elias nodded at Sophia, gratitude flickering in his eyes. The young flight attendant gave him a small, encouraging smile before returning to her duties. Margaret lingered for a moment, her demeanor uncertain, before moving on. The moment passed, but the unease lingered. Elias could feel it in the way the cabin settled, the way the whispers began again, this time quieter but no less sharp. He turned his gaze back to the window, the endless stretch of night sky offering no answers, only questions. What struck him most wasn't the accusation itself. It was the ease with which it had been made. The woman had seen him not as a fellow passenger, not even as a man, but as a convenient target for her frustration. And worse, she had expected everyone to believe her without question. Elias leaned back, the seat suddenly feeling less like a place of comfort and more like a spotlight, casting him in stark relief against the assumptions of those around him. His mind drifted to his father. A man who had once been forced to defend himself against baseless accusations in a time when even speaking out could be dangerous. Keep your head high, but your voice low, his father had often said. A lesson in survival disguised as wisdom. But survival, Elias knew, wasn't enough. Not anymore. As the plane cruised through the night, another shadow appeared beside him. This time, it was the businessman in the gray suit. He leaned over, his cologne sharp and overwhelming, and whispered with mock sincerity. Rough night, huh? Seems like trouble just follows some people. Elias turned his head slowly, meeting the man's gaze with a calm intensity. Trouble, he said quietly, doesn't follow people, it's put on them by others. The businessman blinked, caught off guard by the quiet power in Elias's voice. For a moment, he looked as though he might say something more, but then he straightened, clearing his throat and retreating to his seat. Elias let out a slow breath, the tension in his chest easing slightly. He had spent a lifetime navigating moments like these, balancing the weight of his anger with the necessity of composure. But tonight, the balance felt more precarious than ever. As the cabin lights dimmed further, Sophia returned, a tray in hand. She set a cup of tea on his tray table, her movements careful and deliberate. Chamomile, she said softly. It helps. Elias looked up at her, his expression softening. Thank you, he said. She hesitated, then added, I'm sorry for what you've had to deal with tonight. It's not right. Elias nodded, the words hanging between them like a fragile truce. It's not, he said simply. Sophia left her presence a quiet reminder that even in the midst of struggle, there were allies, however rare they might be. As Elias sipped his tea, the warmth spreading through his chest, he thought about the quiet storm that had built throughout the flight. The glances, the whispers, the accusations. It wasn't the storm itself that wore him down, but the constancy of it, the way it seemed to follow him no matter where he went. He closed his eyes, the tea's warmth mingling with a flicker of resolve. The storm wasn't over, not yet, but Elias Harper had weathered storms before, and he would weather this one, too. The plane flew steady through the night, its engines humming a familiar song of distance and time. But within the cabin, a tension hung in the air like an overfilled balloon, ready to burst with the slightest provocation. Elias Harper sat quietly in his seat, his tea now cold on the tray before him. His mind churned with thoughts, memories, and the steady drumbeat of questions that had followed him all his life. He knew the challenges weren't over. No, they rarely ended. They only shifted, like shadows under the turning sun. Across the aisle, the businessman in the gray suit, whose name Elias had overheard as William Grant, was still watching him, though he tried to appear disinterested. Grant leafed through the pages of his financial newspaper, but his occasional glances over the top betrayed his continued preoccupation with Elias. It was the look of a man who could not reconcile what he saw with what he thought he knew. Elias leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes, willing himself to rest, but even in the stillness, he felt the eyes around him, the quiet judgment that curled itself into the corners of the cabin like smoke. It was the kind of judgment that didn't need words to wound. Then came the unmistakable voice of Margaret, the senior flight attendant, her tone, firm and clipped, sliced through the quiet cabin. "Sir, I need to confirm your ticket again." Elias opened his eyes slowly, his gaze steady as he turned toward her. Margaret stood just a few feet away, her posture stiff, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I've already shown my ticket," Elias replied evenly. "Yes, but there seems to be a discrepancy," Margaret said, her words deliberate, as though she were testing their weight. "Just a quick confirmation, if you don't mind." The murmurs began almost instantly. Passengers shifted in their seats, their curiosity palpable. Some craned their necks for a better view, while others exchanged knowing looks. Elias caught a faint whisper from Grant. "Maybe they'll finally sort this out." Sophia appeared from the galley, her brows knit with concern. "Margaret, is this really necessary?" she asked, her voice low but resolute. "Yes," Margaret replied curtly. "It's standard procedure." Elias reached into his pocket, retrieving the ticket with the same deliberate calm he had carried all evening. He handed it to her without a word, his eyes steady on her face. Margaret's fingers trembled slightly as she took it, but she masked it with the precision of someone used to performing control. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret scanned the ticket, her face betraying nothing as she read the details. After a long pause, she handed it back to Elias with a tight nod. "Everything appears to be in order," she said, her voice flat. "Thank you for your cooperation." Elias took the ticket, sliding it back into his pocket. "You're welcome," he said, his tone as calm as ever. But his words carried an edge, a quiet assertion that he would not be reduced by her actions. Margaret turned to leave, but before she could retreat fully, Sophia stepped closer to Elias. "I'm sorry," Sophia said softly, her words meant only for him. "This isn't fair." Elias nodded, his gratitude clear in his eyes. "It rarely is," he replied. As Margaret disappeared toward the galley, Elias noticed Grant leaning slightly toward him. The man's smirk was gone now, replaced by something sharper, colder. "Quite the fuss for a seat," Grant muttered. His voice was low, but it carried the weight of its intent. "You must be used to that, though." Elias turned his head, meeting Grant's gaze directly. "What exactly do you mean?" he asked, his tone steady but piercing. Grant hesitated for only a moment before answering. "I mean you don't seem like the type who belongs here. And yet, here you are. Funny how that works." The words hung in the air like smoke, acrid and suffocating. Elias could feel the eyes of the cabin on them, passengers pretending not to listen while hanging on every word. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I belong here because I earned my place here," Elias said, his voice low but unyielding. "Just like I've earned my place in every room where men like you have doubted me." Grant's smirk faltered, his confidence cracking ever so slightly under the weight of Elias's words. But before he could respond, a voice from the back of the cabin broke through the tension. "Excuse me." A young black woman stood in the aisle, her voice firm but strained. "I've been trying to get help with my seat, but no one seems to be listening." Margaret reappeared almost instantly, her expression hardening as she approached the woman. "Ma'am, please return to your seat. We'll address your concerns shortly." The woman stood her ground. You've been saying that for the past 30 minutes. She said, her voice rising. Why is it so hard to get basic respect on this flight? Elias watched the scene unfold. His heart tightening. He saw himself in the young woman's defiance. In the way her voice trembled just slightly as she spoke truth to power. And he saw the ripple of discomfort that moved through the cabin. The way passengers averted their eyes, unwilling to acknowledge the deeper truth unfolding before them. Sophia stepped forward again, her presence a steadying force. I'll handle this, she said, her tone firm but kind. She guided the young woman back to her seat, offering quiet reassurance as they moved down the aisle. As the cabin settled once more, Elias leaned back in his seat, his mind heavy with the weight of the evening. The cracks in the mask of civility were growing wider, the unspoken truths pressing against the thin veneer of politeness. And yet, amidst it all, there were moments of light, small acts of courage, quiet affirmations of humanity. He closed his eyes, letting out a slow breath. The storm wasn't over, but it was shifting, and Elias Harper, a man who had weathered storms all his life, was ready for whatever came next. The cabin remained a low murmur of whispers and rustling papers, but beneath the veneer of calm, the tension simmered, threatening to spill over. Elias Harper felt the weight of the evening pressing down on him. Every glance, every hushed word, was another layer added to the suffocating fog of unspoken judgment. The plane might have been traveling smoothly at 35,000 feet. But inside, the turbulence was undeniable. Elias's gaze wandered to the young black woman Sophia had helped earlier. She sat stiffly in her seat, her eyes scanning the cabin with the wary intensity of someone who had learned to anticipate confrontation. Sophia stood a few rows ahead, her face tight with determination as she continued her work. There was a kind of quiet rebellion in her small acts of kindness. Elias thought, in a space so full of silent hostility, she had chosen not to look away. A sudden burst of laughter broke the uneasy quiet. It came from Grant, the man in the gray suit, who was leaning back in his seat, his arms crossed over his chest as he spoke to his seatmate. His voice carried over the cabin like a clanging bell. Can you believe the entitlement? Grant said, loud enough for everyone around him to hear. Some people think they can just claim a spot anywhere they want. First class isn't a charity. After all, Elias felt the words like a slap. Though Grant's gaze never met his. It wasn't meant to. The insult was crafted to hover, to pierce without ever landing directly. It was the kind of cowardly attack Elias had faced countless times before. Daggers thrown from the shadows, where accountability could never reach. But before Elias could respond, another voice cut through the air. Mr. Grant, Sophia said, her tone sharp and unwavering. She stood just a few feet from him, her hands clasped tightly around a tray of glasses. Perhaps you'd like to lower your voice. Not everyone appreciates your commentary. Grant turned his head slowly, his smirk fading into something colder. Excuse me, he said, his tone dripping with mock offense. I wasn't speaking to you. No, Sophia replied, her voice steady, but you made sure everyone could hear you. The cabin grew still, the tension thick enough to choke. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some glancing between Grant and Sophia, others looking resolutely away. Grant opened his mouth to retort. But before he could, Elias spoke. She's right, Elias said, his voice calm but firm. You weren't speaking to her. Or to me, for that matter, but you made sure your words hit their mark. Grant turned his attention to Elias, his smirk returning, though it now carried a flicker of unease. Oh, I see. We're all a little sensitive tonight, aren't we? Elias leaned forward slightly, his gaze unflinching. It's not sensitivity. It's exhausting. You can only hear the same tune played so many times before it wears thin. The cabin was utterly silent now, every eye fixed on the exchange. Even Margaret, who had returned to the galley, stood frozen in place, her expression unreadable. Grant chuckled, though the sound lacked its earlier confidence. I suppose you think you're some kind of martyr, he said. Always the victim, right? Always looking for something to complain about. Elias's hands rested on his knees, steady despite the storm inside him. You see yourself as someone who built everything you have with your own hands. He said, his voice low and deliberate. And maybe you did. But here's the truth. No matter how hard I've worked. No matter what I've achieved. Men like you have always seen me as less. That's not victimhood. That's reality. The words hung in the air. Heavy and undeniable. Grant opened his mouth to respond. But no sound came out. His seatmate looked away, clearly embarrassed. And Grant sank back into his seat with a scowl. Sophia stepped closer to Elias. Her presence a quiet show of solidarity. Would you like some water, Mr. Harper? She asked. Her voice soft. Thank you, Elias said, offering her a small, grateful smile. As she moved away, Margaret re-emerged from the galley. Her face pale but composed. She approached Elias cautiously, her hands clasped in front of her. Mr. Harper, she began, her voice strained. I'd like to apologize for earlier. Elias raised a hand, stopping her. Save it, he said gently but firmly. Your apology doesn't erase the assumptions you've made tonight. It doesn't undo the way you treated me. Or others. Margaret's cheeks flushed. But she nodded. I understand, she said softly, before retreating back to the galley. The cabin remained tense, the air thick with unspoken words. But something had shifted. Grant no longer smirked. Margaret no longer carried the weight of authority in her step. And Elias, despite the exhaustion that clawed at him, felt a small flicker of triumph. He turned his gaze back to the window. The endless expanse of stars reflecting in the glass. This wasn't the first time he had faced such a storm. And it wouldn't be the last. But tonight, for once, the cracks in the mask of civility had exposed the truth beneath. And sometimes, Elias thought, that was enough. The cabin was quiet now. But it was not the kind of peace that soothed. It was the kind that suffocated. The kind that wrapped itself around the passengers like a shroud. Heavy with words left unsaid. Elias Harper remained still in his seat. His hands clasped loosely in his lap. The window beside him reflected the faint contours of his face, etched with the weariness of a man who had lived too long in the shadow of doubt. But the silence was not to last. Margaret reappeared, her steps purposeful, her expression carefully neutral. She stopped beside Elias, her posture straight but her voice hesitant. Mr. Harper, she began, the captain has requested to speak with you privately. Elias turned to her, his expression unreadable. And why would that be necessary? Margaret faltered slightly, but her professionalism held firm. He just wishes to clarify some concerns regarding your seating. Concerns that weren't there before. Elias said, his voice calm but edged with steel. Margaret didn't respond. Instead, she gestured toward the front of the cabin. Her meaning clear. Passengers murmured softly, their curiosity palpable. Elias rose slowly, his movements deliberate, and followed Margaret toward the galley. The galley was a cramped, utilitarian space, a far cry from the polished luxury of the first-class cabin. The captain stood waiting, his uniform crisp, his demeanor grave. His eyes met Elias's briefly before flickering away, as though the weight of the moment was too much to bear. Mr. Harper, the captain began, his tone formal. I want to assure you this is just a routine verification. Elias raised an eyebrow, his skepticism plain. Routine? It hasn't felt routine. The captain cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. We've had feedback from a few passengers. They've expressed concern about your presence in first class. Elias felt the words like a punch to the gut, though he did not flinch. His voice, when he spoke, was steady. Concern about my presence, or assumptions about my identity? The captain hesitated, his composure slipping. I don't believe anyone intended to. Quote. To what? Elias interrupted, his voice rising slightly. To make me feel out of place? To question my right to be here? You may not have intended it, Captain, but the result is the same. Margaret shifted uneasily, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The captain glanced at her briefly before turning back to Elias. Mr. Harper, he said, his tone softer now. I apologize if you felt unwelcome. That was not our intention. Elias let out a slow breath, his shoulders relaxing slightly. An apology doesn't erase what's happened here, he said, but it's a start. Before the captain could respond, The sound of raised voices drew their attention back toward the cabin. Margaret moved quickly, with Elias and the captain following close behind. As they entered the aisle, they saw the young black woman from earlier standing in the middle of the cabin. Her hands clenched into fists. Across from her was Grant, his face red with anger. "You need to calm down," Grant said, his voice loud and condescending. "You're making a scene." "I'm making a scene?" the woman shot back, her voice trembling with rage. "You've been disrespecting people all night. And now I'm the problem?" Passengers watched the exchange with a mix of fascination and discomfort, their eyes darting between the two like spectators at a boxing match. Sophia stood nearby, her expression torn between stepping in and letting the moment play out. Elias stepped forward, his presence commanding. "Enough," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. The cabin fell silent, every eye turning toward him. Elias looked at the young woman first, his voice gentle but firm. "What's your name?" he asked. "Jasmine," she replied, her anger giving way to uncertainty. "Jasmine," Elias said, "you have every right to stand up for yourself. But don't let him bait you into losing your composure. That's what he wants." Jasmine nodded slowly, her fists unclenching. Elias then turned his attention to Grant, his gaze unrelenting. "And you," he said, his voice harder now, "your words have consequences. You may think you're clever, hiding behind insinuations and smirks. But we see you. We've always seen you." Grant's smirk faltered, his confidence cracking under the weight of Elias's words. He opened his mouth to respond but found nothing to say. The captain stepped forward, his expression stern. "Mr. Grant," he said, "I suggest you sit down and remain silent for the remainder of the flight." Grant hesitated, his defiance flickering like a dying flame. Before sinking back into his seat, Jasmine returned to hers as well, her shoulders still tense but her resolve unbroken. Elias stood in the aisle for a moment longer, his gaze sweeping across the cabin. He saw the discomfort in the faces of the passengers, the way they avoided his eyes. But he also saw something else. Small glimmers of recognition, of reflection. When he returned to his seat, Sophia was waiting with a fresh cup of tea. "You handled that well," she said softly, setting the cup on his tray table. "Did I?" Elias asked, his voice heavy with weariness. Sophia nodded. "You said what needed to be said." Elias lifted the cup, the warmth seeping into his hands. He took a sip, his gaze drifting back to the window. Outside, the horizon was beginning to lighten, the first hints of dawn breaking through the darkness. The storm had not passed, but Elias felt a small measure of peace. The cracks in the facade had widened, and through them, the light was beginning to shine. The plane began its descent. The cabin bathed in the pale, tentative light of early morning. Shadows softened, and the edges of the world seemed less sharp, as though the night's tensions had smoothed themselves into something more bearable. But for Elias Harper, the weight in his chest remained. It was a familiar burden, one he had carried all his life. The persistent ache of navigating a world that demanded he justify his existence at every turn. The cabin was unusually quiet. Passengers who had previously whispered and stared now sat in thoughtful silence, their gazes lowered, their postures subdued. Even Grant, the businessman whose smugness had filled the space like a noxious gas, seemed deflated, his eyes fixed on the tray table before him. Elias sat back in his seat, his fingers tracing the rim of the teacup Sophia had given him earlier. The tea had long gone cold, but he kept it there as a small comfort, a reminder that not every gesture was weighted with suspicion or disdain. Sophia's quiet defiance had been a light in the darkness, and for that, he was grateful. Margaret, the senior flight attendant, approached once more, though this time her steps were hesitant, her face uncharacteristically soft. She stopped just beside Elias's seat, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Mr. Harper," she began, her voice low, "I'd like to personally apologize for everything that's happened during this flight." She hesitated, her professionalism cracking under the strain of her own discomfort. "I should have handled things differently." Elias looked up at her, his gaze steady but unreadable. "You should have," he said simply. Margaret flinched at the bluntness of his words but nodded. You're right, she said. I've been doing this job for a long time. And I thought I knew better. But I didn't see you for who you are. And I'm sorry. Elias studied her for a moment, searching her face for signs of sincerity. He saw it there, buried beneath the layers of guilt and shame. He nodded once. Thank you, he said. But remember, it's not just about seeing me. It's about seeing everyone. Margaret nodded again, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She stepped away, retreating to the galley as the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their imminent arrival. As the plane descended further, the view outside the window shifted. The clouds parted, revealing a sprawling landscape bathed in golden light. Cities and fields stretched out below, their details sharpening with each passing moment. It was a beautiful, almost surreal contrast to the turmoil that had unfolded within the cabin. Jasmine, the young black woman who had stood her ground against Grant, turned in her seat to look at Elias. Thank you, she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of unspoken gratitude. Elias offered her a small smile. You didn't need me, he said. You were strong enough on your own. Jasmine shook her head. Maybe, but sometimes, it helps to see someone else standing with you. The plane touched down smoothly, the engines roaring briefly before settling into a quiet hum. Passengers stirred, unbuckling their seatbelts and gathering their belongings. The atmosphere was different now, less tense, more contemplative. As Elias stood to retrieve his bag, he felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Grant, his face pale but earnest. Mr. Harper, Grant said, his voice low. I owe you an apology. For what I said, for how I acted. I was wrong. Elias regarded him carefully, his expression unreadable. What made you change your mind? He asked. Grant hesitated, his hand dropping to his side. I don't know, he admitted. Maybe it was seeing how calm you stayed. Or how wrong I felt when I realized what I'd done. I've never had to think about these things before. Not really, but now. He trailed off, his shoulders slumping slightly. Elias nodded slowly. It's a start, he said. The question is, what will you do with it? Grant didn't answer right away. Instead, he extended his hand. Thank you, he said. Elias paused, then shook the man's hand briefly. Don't thank me, he said. Just do better. The passengers began filing off the plane, their steps hesitant, as though leaving the cabin might disrupt the fragile balance that had been achieved. Sophia stood by the exit, her expression a mix of pride and sadness. It was an honor having you on this flight, Mr. Harper, she said as Elias approached. The honor was mine, Elias replied. He hesitated, then added, keep speaking up, Sophia. The world needs more voices like yours. Sophia smiled, her eyes shining. I'll try. Elias stepped off the plane and into the terminal, the familiar chaos of the airport greeting him like an old adversary. The world outside hadn't changed, he knew that much. The same challenges, the same prejudices, would greet him at every turn. But as he walked toward the baggage claim, his steps steady and unhurried, he felt a quiet resolve settle over him. Change, he thought, was never immediate. It was slow, painstaking, and often infuriating, but it began in moments like these. In the breaking of silences, in the confrontation of truths, and in the small, brave acts of defiance that refused to let the world remain as it was. Elias Harper didn't know if he had changed the minds of everyone on that plane. But he had planted seeds, of doubt, of reflection,